Welcome back into the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel, everybody. My name is Lucas Wencl, and today we're talking about 10 players that you should be looking to stash ahead of the Week 16 slate and ahead of next week's waiver run as well. Before we dive on into that list of players, though, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today. Kicking off our list this week is Baltimore Ravens running back Justice Hill, who's rostered in 19% of leagues. As we're only 1 week away from the Fantasy Championship in the majority of formats, we have to make sure our championship hopes stay intact by ensuring our stud running backs. Justice Hill hasn't had a single game with more than 5 carries this year, but he has been getting it done in the receiving game recently, drawing at least 5 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. He's given you 3 top 30 finishes and 2 top 15 finishes during that stretch as well, making him a more intriguing stash in PPR formats. Primarily, though, we want Justice Hill's stash because he's the primary backup to Derrick Henry in this Baltimore Ravens offense. And one of the worst things that could happen to your team is that Derrick Henry gets injured in Week 16 and you're down a viable option at running back going into the championship. So let's make sure you get Justice Hill stashed if you're a Derrick Henry manager. Our second stash this week is Buffalo Bills running back Ray Davis, who's rostered in 19% of leagues. I am well aware that Ty Johnson has been stealing the show over the last 2 weeks, but I'm going to guess that his 24 yards per reception doesn't continue to hold up. Davis continues to function as the backup ball carrier to James Cook, getting 7 carries and 2 targets of his own last week against the Detroit Lions. He managed to find the end zone on a 5-yard reception as well, marking his second top 25 finish in his last 3 games. If anything were to happen to James Cook this week, we could see a repeat of Week 6 for Ray Davis, where he was given 23 opportunities and gained 152 total yards against the Jets. This Buffalo Bills offense is red hot right now, and Ray Davis would immediately land in running back 2 territory if he were to become the lead back in this Bills backfield. So if you're a James Cook manager, let's make sure all of your bases are covered here and stash Ray Davis. The next player to consider stashing is San Francisco 49ers running back Patrick Taylor Jr., who's rostered in 18% of leagues as of this recording. At this point, you have to be convinced that something is in the water in San Francisco because Isaac Guerendo has now been deemed unlikely to play in Sunday's game against the Dolphins with a hamstring injury. That puts Christian McCaffrey on IR, Jordan Mason on IR, and Isaac Guerendo dealing with 2 different injuries in back-to-back weeks. That leaves Patrick Taylor Jr. and Israel Abanikanda as the only 2 healthy and active running backs for Kyle Shanahan. If Guerendo remains out through Week 17 as well, Patrick Taylor will remain in the running back 2 conversation for the Fantasy Championship. We've seen Shanahan just feed the full workload to the next man up, so we could be in for a league-winning stretch from Patrick Taylor Jr. of all people this year. Coming in next, we have Los Angeles Rams running back Blake Corum, who's rostered in 15% of leagues. Corum has been far less productive than the likes of Justice Hill and Ray Davis, but he's just as valuable as a handcuff for Kyren Williams. Blake Corum has been the only other Rams running back to play a snap besides Kyren Williams since Week 4, so it's clear Corum is next in line ahead of Ronnie Rivers for lead back duties. Everyone was concerned about Kyren's durability during the preseason, but now it's a time you should be most concerned about it with the Fantasy Championship only 1 week away. If anything happens to Kyren, it's Blake Corum who will be the lead back against the Arizona Cardinals, who are 3rd in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs in their last 5 contests. Again, we're just making sure to cover all of our bases here, especially if you're the Kyren Williams manager. Another handcuff running back you should look to stash is Cam Akers of the Minnesota Vikings, who's rostered in 15% of leagues. Akers didn't have the most efficient evening on Monday Night Football in Week 15, but he was given 10 carries and found the end zone against the Bears. Akers has surprisingly been a top 40 running back in 5 of his last 7 games and has supplanted Ty Chandler as the handcuff to Aaron Jones in this Vikings offense. Aaron Jones isn't as productive of a back as a Derrick Henry or a Kyren Williams, but if he were to pick up an injury in Week 16, Akers would get a solid matchup against the Green Bay Packers at home in Week 17. Akers isn't the sexiest handcuff stash out there, but you could certainly do a lot worse. Next on our stash list is Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver Calvin Austin, who's rostered in 8% of leagues. George Pickens has missed the last 2 weeks with a hamstring injury, and as of this recording, he may be in danger of missing Week 16 as well. Calvin Austin has become the team's wide receiver 1 in his absence, pacing all Steelers pass catchers in Week 15 with 5 catches on 5 targets for 65 yards. Surprisingly enough, Calvin Austin has finished as a top 40 wide receiver in 3 of his last 4 games. Now, you're not slotting Calvin Austin into your lineup, but he does get a great matchup with the Baltimore Ravens on Saturday, who have given up the 2nd most fantasy points per game and 17 touchdowns to wideouts this year. You could do a lot worse than stashing Calvin Austin at the end of your bench, especially if George Pickens continues to be bothered by his hamstring injury. Moving on to our next stash, we have Carolina Panthers wide receiver Jalen Coker, who's rostered in 5% of leagues. We're back, baby! Jalen Coker hauled in an 83-yard touchdown on Sunday against the Cowboys, elevating him to 21 fantasy points on the afternoon. He also led the team in snaps and ran only 2 less routes than Adam Thielen. Xavier Legette did leave this game in the 3rd quarter and has now been deemed doubtful for Sunday's game against the Cardinals. This opens up the door for Coker to play a more prominent role as Bryce Young's second option in the passing game. If Legette is held out through the fantasy championship as well, he gets a mouth-watering matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have been bleeding points to wide receivers this year. This is the perfect late-season high-upside wide receiver stash you need to be looking for, so get Coker stashed ASAP. The last handcuffed running back we'll talk about this week is Jaylen Wright of the Miami Dolphins, who's rostered in 5% of leagues. The recent snap shares will suggest that Raheem Mostert has reclaimed the running back 2 duties in this Miami Dolphins offense, but I'm not convinced that if something were to happen to Devon Achane, Jaylen Wright wouldn't see the bulk of the carries. His initial trial run in weeks 9 through 12 didn't go great. He barely averaged 2 yards per carry and wasn't involved in the passing game. But if we're being honest, Raheem Mostert hasn't been much better recently, barely averaging 2.5 yards per carry in his last 2 games. We know how fragile this backfield is, and all it takes is for Devon Achane to take a big hit in Week 16, and people are clamoring for Jaylen Wright on the waiver wire before Week 17. Wright is also more widely available than the likes of Raheem Mostert, so if you have Devon Achane, it wouldn't hurt to have Jaylen Wright stashed at the end of your bench. A sneaky stash to consider targeting this week is wide receiver Dyami Brown of the Washington Commanders, who's rostered in less than 1% of leagues. Brown may have his number called more frequently on Sunday against the Eagles because the Commanders' pass catchers have been dropping like flies. Noah Brown was placed on IR last week with a kidney injury, and Zach Ertz now finds himself in concussion protocol. Dyami Brown played 78% of the team's snaps against New Orleans, which was only 9 fewer than Terry McLaurin and well ahead of Olamide Zaccheaus. Look, for a guy who's rostered in less than 1% of leagues, this is mostly for y'all in the deepest of leagues. But you could do a lot worse than a guy who has out of nowhere become the number 2 receiving option in this team's offense. Last but not least, for all of you playing in leagues where you start a defense and special teams unit, you can look to stash the Miami Dolphins, who are rostered in 47% of leagues. This roster percentage is extremely high for this video, I know, but there may be no better matchup in Week 17 than the Dolphins drawing the Dorian Thompson-Robinson-led Cleveland Browns. Miami's secondary could have a field day, and the Browns are allowing a league-high 4.1 sacks per game this year. If the Dolphins unit is still floating out on your waiver wire, they're going to be one of the top options for championship week, so make sure you get them stashed now before your league mates jump on them. Alrighty, y'all, that's it. That's all I've got for you here today, but before we sign off, remember, you can take the guesswork out of waiver wire decisions with FantasyPros Waiver Assistant. It will give you instant analysis on potential moves from over 100 fantasy experts. You'll also discover both the weekly and rest of season impact for every waiver ad. All you have to do is visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Again, all you have to do, visit fantasypros.com/myplaybook or download the Fantasy Football My Playbook app to optimize your roster today.